Your son is gone. Stop acting like this is your house. Those were the words my daughter-in-law Claire said to me the night after we buried my son. She didn't shout them. She didn't slam her hand on the table. She said them calmly like she was discussing the weather, while folding her napkin beside her dinner plate. For a moment no one spoke. The kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall, each second echoing through the quiet dining room of the house I had lived in for nearly 35 years. I remember staring at the steam rising from my cup of coffee, wondering how something as ordinary as dinner could suddenly feel so unfamiliar. My name is Margaret Lawson. I'm 71 years old, and until that evening, I believed that no matter how difficult life became, family would always be the one place where I belonged. My son Daniel used to say this house had a heartbeat. He said it every Thanksgiving when the kitchen smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon, when football games hummed softly from the television and neighbors dropped by with pies. Daniel believed homes were alive because of the people inside them. And for most of my life I believed that too. But that night, sitting across from Claire, I realized a house can feel very different when the person who held it together is gone. It had been exactly 8 days since Daniel passed away. 8 days since the hospital room fell silent, and the doctor quietly said there was nothing more they could do. 8 days since I held my son's hand and felt the warmth fade from it. A mother is not supposed to outlive her child. Everyone says that. But the truth of it only arrives when you're standing in a cemetery holding a folded flag, and wondering how the world kept turning while yours stopped. Claire sat at the head of the table that evening, the seat Daniel had always taken. Her posture was straight, her shoulders squared, as if she had already decided something long before I walked into the room. She had always been beautiful in a polished magazine sort of way. Perfect hair, perfect smile, the kind of woman who made everything look effortless. When Daniel first introduced us 15 years ago, I tried very hard to welcome her. I remember baking her favorite blueberry pie from scratch the first time she came over. I remember telling my friends how lucky my son was. I wanted peace in the family. I always did. But that night, something in Claire's eyes felt colder than I had ever seen before. I noticed it when she poured herself a glass of water without asking if I wanted any. I noticed it when she slid Daniel's old chair slightly closer to her side of the table. Small things really. The kind of things you might ignore on any other day. But grief has a way of sharpening your senses. You start to notice every silence, every glance, every word that doesn't quite land the way it should. Claire lifted her fork and took a bite of roasted chicken. You'll need to start making arrangements, she said after a moment, as if she were reminding someone about a dentist appointment. I looked up from my plate. Arrangements? I asked quietly. She dabbed her lips with her napkin and met my eyes. Yes. For where you'll go. The words hung in the air between us. At first I thought I must have misunderstood. I had slept very little since Daniel died. Grief can cloud your mind, make everything feel distant and unreal. I live here, I said slowly. Claire gave a small smile. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was the kind of smile someone gives when explaining something obvious to a child. Margaret, she said gently, Daniel is gone. Things are different now. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. I could hear the faint sound of a car passing outside on Maple Street. The whole world continued moving, completely unaware that my life was shifting beneath my feet. Your son is gone, Claire repeated, setting down her fork. Stop acting like this is your house. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around the room. The oak cabinets Daniel installed himself 15 years ago were still there. The small crack in the tile near the stove was still there too, from the time he dropped a toolbox while fixing the sink. Every corner of that kitchen held pieces of our lives. I had packed Daniel's school lunches there. I had sat at that same table helping him with algebra homework when he was 16. I had waited there countless nights while he drove home from college during winter storms. Houses. Remember things like that even if people forget. Claire leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. You'll need to pack your things, she said. Soon. Her voice remained calm, measured, almost polite. That was the part that surprised me most. Cruelty doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed in reason and practicality. I folded my hands in my lap and took a slow breath. For a moment I could almost hear Daniel laughing somewhere in the house, the way he used to when the dog chased squirrels across the backyard. I wondered what he would think if he were sitting here now. I wondered if he would recognize the woman sitting across from me. Finally, I stood up from the table. My chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor. Claire watched me closely, waiting for an argument, perhaps even hoping for one. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply looked at her and nodded once. "I see," I said. Then I turned and walked upstairs, leaving the dishes untouched on the table, while somewhere deep inside me a quiet realization began to form. Claire believed the house belonged to her now. What she didn't realize yet was that Daniel had never been the kind of man to leave things uncertain. The house sounded different the next morning. It was a quiet that did not feel peaceful, the kind of silence that sits in the corners of the rooms and reminds you that something important is missing. I woke before sunrise, the way I had every day since Daniel passed away. For 35 years my mornings had begun with the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway, and the low sound of Daniel moving around in the kitchen before work. Even when he was grown, even when he had his own life, he would stop by the house most mornings on his way to the office. He said the coffee tasted better here. That morning there was no coffee, only the faint hum of the furnace and the distant sound of a garbage truck turning onto Maple Street. I sat up slowly in the bed that had once belonged to my late husband and me. The room still carried the familiar scent of cedar from the old dresser by the window. Daniel had helped me move that dresser upstairs 20 years ago, when my husband passed away. He was only 28 then, strong and determined, insisting that I should never have to carry heavy furniture by myself again. I sat there for a long moment, letting the early morning light spill across the floorboards. From upstairs the house still looked the same. The hallway pictures were still hanging in place. Daniel's high school graduation photo still rested on the small table near the stairs. But something about the air in the house had shifted. You can feel it when a place no longer welcomes you the way it once did. I put on my robe and walked downstairs. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Claire was already awake, standing at the counter with a spray bottle in her hand, wiping the surface where we had eaten dinner the night before. She did not look up when I entered the room. "Good morning," I said quietly. My voice sounded smaller than usual in that wide kitchen. Claire finished wiping the counter before answering. "Morning," she replied without turning around. The word hung in the air between us, polite but distant. I moved toward the coffee maker and filled the pot with water. For a moment I wondered if I should ask whether she wanted some. That had always been the habit in this house. Offer coffee. Offer breakfast. Make the morning gentle for whoever was sharing the table with you. But something in Claire's posture told me the old habits were no longer welcome. I brewed a single cup and carried it to the table. Claire continued cleaning in silence, opening cabinets and rearranging things with careful, deliberate movements. After a few minutes I noticed that the family photographs that normally sat along the windowsill were gone. The empty strip of wood looked strangely bare without them. "Where are the pictures?" I asked. Claire glanced briefly toward the window. "I packed them away," she said. "The room looks less cluttered this way." I nodded slowly and took a sip of coffee. The taste was bitter, though I had used the same beans Daniel always bought from the grocery store down the street. Outside the window the maple trees in the yard swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Daniel used to rake those leaves every October, piling them into tall golden mounds along the driveway. As a boy he would jump into them laughing, pretending the pile was deep enough to swallow him whole. Later, when he was older, he kept raking them simply because he said the yard looked better that way. I watched Claire open the drawer where the house keys were usually kept. She lifted the small wooden tray and slid something inside before closing the drawer again. The movement was quick, but not quick enough to escape my attention. When she turned around, she found me looking at her. "Is there something you need, Margaret?" she asked. Her voice carried the same calm tone from the night before. Practical. Controlled. I set my cup down gently on the table. "No," I said. "Just thinking." Claire nodded once and returned to the counter. A few minutes later her phone rang. She stepped into the living room to answer it, lowering her voice as she spoke. I could not hear every word, but one sentence drifted clearly through the doorway. "Yes, I think we can list it soon," she said. I remained very still in my chair. Outside the maple leaves continued to fall across the yard Daniel loved so much. And in that quiet moment, I began to understand that Claire was already planning a future in this house that did not include me. Claire spent the rest of that morning moving through the house as if she were already in charge of every corner of it. I watched quietly from the kitchen table while she opened drawers, checked cabinets, and wrote small notes on a yellow legal pad she had placed beside the refrigerator. The scratching sound of her pen seemed unusually loud in the stillness of the room. Every so often she would pause, glance around the kitchen, and then write something else down. It was the kind of behavior that might seem ordinary to anyone else, but when you have lived in a house for more than 3 decades, you learn the rhythm of every movement inside it. You know when something is normal and when something is not. Around 10 o'clock that morning, Claire put on her coat and picked up her car keys. She did not explain where she was going. She simply said she had errands to run and walked out the front door with the same calm confidence she had shown the night before. Through the window I watched her car pull slowly down the driveway and turn onto Maple Street. The moment the sound of the engine faded, the house fell silent again. I remained at the kitchen table for a long time after she left, staring at the yellow legal pad she had forgotten beside the refrigerator. Finally I stood up and walked over to it. I did not touch the pad at first. I simply read what was written on the top page. The words were neat and organized, written in Claire's careful handwriting. Paint estimate. Storage rental. Realtor meeting Thursday. I read the last line twice before stepping back from the counter. Realtor meeting Thursday. The words were small, but they carried a weight that settled heavily in my chest. For the first time since Daniel passed away, the shape of Claire's plan began to appear clearly in my mind. She was not only asking me to leave, she was preparing to sell the house. I walked slowly into the living room and sat down in the old armchair beside the window. Daniel used to sit there on Sunday afternoons watching football while the smell of chili simmered in the kitchen. I could almost see him there now, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, explaining the rules of the game to me for the 100th time. I never really understood football, but I always listened because it made him happy. The sunlight moved across the living room carpet, while I sat there remembering those quiet moments. After a while I stood up and walked toward the hallway that led to Daniel's office. The door had been closed since the day he passed away. Claire had not entered that room yet, at least not while I was watching. I rested my hand on the doorknob and hesitated. Something about opening that door felt like stepping into a memory I was not sure I was ready to face. Daniel had spent countless evenings in that office, answering work emails, paying bills, and occasionally calling me in just to show me a photograph he had found online of someplace he dreamed about visiting one day. Finally I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. His desk was exactly the way he had left it. A stack of folders sat neatly beside his laptop, and a small brass lamp cast a soft circle of light across the polished wood surface. For a moment I stood there without moving, allowing myself to absorb the quiet presence of the room. Then I noticed something that made me pause. The top drawer of Daniel's desk was slightly open. Daniel had always been a careful man. He closed every drawer, every cabinet, every door behind him. Seeing that drawer left ajar felt strangely out of place. I stepped closer and pulled the drawer open the rest of the way. Inside were the usual things one might expect. Pens, a calculator, several envelopes, and a small leather notebook Daniel often carried during meetings. Beneath those items, tucked neatly against the back of the drawer, was a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. I stared at the envelope for a long time before picking it up. The paper felt heavier than I expected, as if whatever rested inside it carried more than just words. Outside, a gust of wind moved through the maple trees, scattering leaves across the driveway Daniel used to rake every autumn. And as I stood there holding that envelope, a quiet thought began to take shape in my mind. Daniel had always been a careful man. The kind of man who believed in preparing for things long before anyone else saw them coming. I stood in Daniel's office holding the envelope with my name written across the front, and for a moment I did not move at all. The house was completely quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock down the hallway. I traced the letters of my name with my fingers. Daniel had always had very steady handwriting. Even as a child his letters were neat and careful, the kind of writing teachers would compliment during parent conferences. Seeing those familiar strokes of ink now felt almost like hearing his voice again. I sat down slowly in the chair behind his desk. The leather creaked softly under my weight, a sound I had heard countless times when Daniel worked late in that room. For a long moment I simply held the envelope in my hands without opening it. Outside the office window, the maple tree in the backyard swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, its leaves glowing gold in the autumn sunlight. Daniel planted that tree when he was 23 years old. He said every home needed something that would outlive the people inside it. I finally slid my finger under the seal and opened the envelope carefully, trying not to tear the paper. Inside was a folded letter and a small stack of documents clipped together. The first thing I saw was Daniel's handwriting again. The letter was dated 2 months before the day he died. I felt my chest tighten as I began to read. Daniel's words were calm and thoughtful, just the way he always spoke when he wanted someone to understand something important. He wrote that if I was reading the letter, it meant he was no longer there to explain things himself. He apologized for leaving me with questions he could no longer answer. And then he wrote something that made my hands tremble slightly. He said he had been worried for some time that things in the house might become complicated if something happened to him. Daniel had always been observant. Even as a boy, he noticed small details other people missed. If 2 neighbors argued on the street, he could tell you exactly who started it. If someone was unhappy but trying to hide it, Daniel would quietly notice that too. In the letter he explained that during the past year, he had sensed a growing distance between Claire and the rest of the family. He did not accuse her of anything directly. That was not Daniel's way. But he wrote that he believed it was wise to prepare for possibilities before they became problems. Beneath the letter were the documents clipped neatly together. The first page carried the letterhead of a law office downtown. Robert Hayes, attorney at law. I recognized the name immediately. Robert had been Daniel's friend since college, and had handled several legal matters for our family over the years. My eyes moved slowly across the page as I read the title printed at the top of the document. Last Will and Testament Amendment. I felt the air leave my lungs as I continued reading. The document explained that Daniel had updated certain parts of his estate plan 2 months earlier. The language was formal and precise, the kind lawyers always use when they want every word to mean exactly one thing. But the meaning itself was not difficult to understand. Daniel had made a very specific decision about the house on Maple Street, the house where I was sitting right now. According to the document, full ownership of the property would remain in my name for the rest of my life. The words were clear. Irrevocable lifetime residency and property control granted to Margaret Lawson. I read the sentence again just to be certain I had not misunderstood it. Daniel had not only thought about what might happen after he was gone. He had taken steps to make sure I would never be forced out of this house. For a long moment I sat there staring at the document while the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the desk. Downstairs I heard the faint sound of a car door closing. Claire had returned home earlier than I expected. Her footsteps moved through the kitchen and then into the living room, the familiar rhythm of someone walking through a house they believed belonged entirely to them. I folded the documents carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. My hands felt steady now in a way they had not felt since Daniel died. Grief was still there, of course. Losing a child does not become easier simply because you discover a piece of paper that changes a situation. But something inside me had settled into a quiet clarity. Daniel had seen the possibility of this moment long before it arrived. He had prepared for it in the only way he could. I stood up from the chair and looked around the office one more time. His desk, his bookshelves, the brass lamp casting its warm circle of light across the wood. Everything in the room carried the calm order Daniel always preferred. I slipped the envelope into my robe pocket just as Claire's voice drifted up the stairs. "Margaret," she called from the bottom of the hallway. "We need to talk about the moving arrangements." I paused for a moment, resting my hand on the doorframe of Daniel's office. Claire believed the conversation downstairs would be about when I planned to leave the house. What she did not know yet was that Daniel had already answered that question 2 months earlier. I walked down the hallway slowly after Claire called my name, keeping my hand in the pocket of my robe where the envelope rested. The paper felt firm and reassuring against my fingers, like a quiet reminder that Daniel had not left things unfinished. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Claire was standing in the living room beside the coffee table with her yellow legal pad open again. The afternoon light poured through the front windows and illuminated the neat columns of notes she had written earlier that morning. She looked up the moment she saw me and gestured toward the couch as if we were about to discuss something ordinary. "We should go over the timeline," she said. Her tone was calm and practical, the same tone someone might use when planning a weekend trip. I sat down across from her and folded my hands together in my lap. Claire flipped the page on the legal pad and tapped the paper with her pen. "I spoke with a realtor today," she said. "She believes the house could sell quickly if we list it before the holidays. The market is strong right now." She spoke confidently, as if the decision had already been made and the only remaining detail was how soon I would pack my belongings. I listened quietly without interrupting. Claire continued outlining her plan in careful steps. She said the painter would come next week to freshen the walls. After that, a photographer would take pictures for the listing. She even mentioned renting a small storage unit so that some of the furniture could be removed to make the rooms appear larger for potential buyers. Her voice carried a steady rhythm, the voice of someone explaining a well-organized project. When she finally paused, she looked directly at me. "You should start sorting through your things soon," she said. "It would make everything easier if you moved out before the house goes on the market." For a moment I studied her expression. There was no anger in her face, no raised voice, no harsh words. Just the quiet certainty of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. I thought about the years Daniel spent building his life here. I remembered the weekends he spent fixing the porch railing, the long evenings he spent in his office reviewing paperwork, the maple tree he planted in the backyard because he believed every home deserved something that would grow long after he was gone. Claire leaned forward slightly and rested her pen on the legal pad. "Margaret," she said gently, "this is the most practical solution. For everyone." I nodded slowly and glanced toward the hallway that led to Daniel's office. The envelope in my pocket remained exactly where I had placed it. Claire noticed the direction of my gaze and followed it briefly before looking back at me. "I know this house has memories," she continued, "but holding on to it will not change what happened." I let a quiet breath leave my lungs before answering. "You are right," I said. Claire seemed relieved by my calm tone. She relaxed slightly in her seat and closed the legal pad as if the difficult part of the conversation had already passed. "I am glad you understand," she said. "If you start packing this week, we can probably have everything finished within 2 weeks." The room grew quiet again. Outside, a gust of wind carried a handful of golden leaves across the front lawn. I watched them slide along the driveway Daniel used to sweep every autumn. Claire reached for the legal pad again and began writing another note. "I will call the storage company tomorrow," she said. "That should give you enough time to organize everything." For several seconds I did not respond. Instead I reached slowly into the pocket of my robe and felt the smooth edge of the envelope beneath my fingers. Claire looked up when she noticed the movement. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Her voice carried a trace of impatience now, as if she expected me to protest or argue after all. I removed my hand from my pocket but kept the envelope hidden against my side. "No," I said quietly. "Nothing is wrong." Claire studied my face carefully, searching for some reaction she could measure or anticipate, but I gave her none. After a moment she returned to writing on the legal pad, already moving forward with the next step of her plan. As I watched her pen glide across the paper, a calm realization settled into my mind. Claire believed she was preparing to sell this house within the next few weeks. She believed the conversation we were having was about how quickly I could leave. What she did not know was that Daniel had already arranged something very different long before this afternoon arrived. That evening the house grew quiet again after Claire finished her calls and went upstairs. I remained in the living room long after the sun had disappeared behind the maple trees. The yellow legal pad still rested on the coffee table, its pages filled with neat lists and careful timelines for a future Claire believed was already decided. I did not move it. Instead I sat in Daniel's old armchair beside the window and listened to the soft creaks of the house settling into the night. Houses make those sounds when the temperature changes, small shifting noises in the wood and pipes that most people barely notice. But after living somewhere for decades, those sounds become familiar, almost like the breathing of an old friend. Around 8:30 Claire came downstairs again carrying her phone. She walked through the living room without looking at me and headed straight for the kitchen. A moment later I heard her voice speaking quietly as she dialed someone. The words were not loud enough to hear clearly at first, but after a few seconds her tone sharpened slightly and her voice carried down the hallway. "Yes, I spoke with her," she said. "She understands the situation." I remained very still in the chair, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Claire paused while the person on the other end spoke. Then she continued in the same measured voice. "No, she will not cause any trouble. She knows the house will be listed soon." The words drifted through the doorway and settled heavily in the room around me. I glanced toward the staircase where the hallway light cast a pale glow across the wooden steps Daniel used to climb to at a time when he was younger. Claire spoke for another minute before ending the call. When she returned to the living room, she seemed surprised to find me still sitting there. "You should try to get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be a busy day." I gave a small nod. "For you perhaps," I replied gently. Claire did not respond to that. She simply walked upstairs again and closed the bedroom door behind her. I remained where I was until the house fell completely silent once more. After a while I stood up and walked slowly down the hallway toward the small desk in the corner of the living room. That desk had been there since Daniel was in high school. He used to sit there finishing homework while I prepared dinner in the kitchen. The lamp on. The desk still worked, and when I turned it on, a soft circle of light spread across the surface of the wood. I reached into the pocket of my robe and removed the envelope Daniel had left in his office. The paper felt slightly warm now from being carried against my side for most of the afternoon. For a moment I simply looked at it again, remembering the careful way Daniel used to plan things long before anyone else thought about them. Then I reached for the telephone that rested beside the lamp. I dialed the number printed on the top of the legal document, and waited quietly as the call connected. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Robert Hayes speaking." I felt a calm steadiness settle into my voice as I replied. "Robert, this is Margaret Lawson." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by a softer tone. "Margaret," he said. "I was very sorry to hear about Daniel." I thanked him quietly and glanced toward the staircase to make sure Claire was still upstairs. The hallway remained empty. "Robert," I said after a moment, "I believe Daniel left something in his desk that you prepared." Another short pause followed. When Robert spoke again, his voice carried a careful seriousness. "Yes," he said. "Daniel asked me to place those documents there in case you ever needed them." I closed my eyes for a moment as the weight of Daniel's foresight settled fully into place. "I think that moment may have arrived," I told him. Robert did not ask for further explanation right away. Instead, he spoke with the calm patience that had always made him a good attorney. "Would you like me to come by the house tomorrow morning?" he asked. I looked around the quiet living room, at the familiar furniture and the photographs Claire had not yet removed from the mantel. "Yes," I said. "I believe that would be very helpful." When I ended the call, I sat for a moment longer beneath the small desk lamp. Upstairs the house remained quiet, and somewhere beyond the window the wind moved gently through the maple tree Daniel had planted so many years ago. Claire believed tomorrow would be another step in preparing this house to be sold. What she did not yet understand was that tomorrow morning would bring a conversation she had not planned for at all. The next morning arrived with a pale gray sky, and the quiet chill that often settles over Maple Street in late autumn. I woke before sunrise again, though this time my mind felt clearer than it had in days. The envelope Daniel had left was resting on the small desk in the living room where I had placed it the night before. For a few seconds I simply stood there looking at it while the house slowly came to life around me. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen, and somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked as Claire moved through the hallway. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the early morning light filter through the maple branches outside. Daniel used to say that quiet mornings were when people thought the most clearly. I understood what he meant now. Around 8:30 the sound of a car engine rolled up the driveway. I glanced out the window and saw a familiar dark blue sedan pull to a stop near the curb. A moment later Robert Hayes stepped out of the car, adjusting the collar of his coat as he looked up at the house. Robert had aged a little since the last time I saw him, but his posture was the same as always, steady and thoughtful. Before I could stand up to greet him, Claire entered the kitchen from the hallway carrying her phone and a cup of tea. She stopped when she noticed the car outside. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. Her voice carried a hint of suspicion. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Yes, I said calmly. Robert Hayes is stopping by this morning. Claire frowned slightly as she looked through the window again. Daniel's lawyer? She asked. I nodded. Claire hesitated for a moment as if trying to understand why a lawyer would be visiting the house so soon after the funeral. Then she set her cup down on the counter and folded her arms. Is there some paperwork we need to discuss? She asked. There is, I replied quietly. A few seconds later the doorbell rang. I stood up and walked to the front door while Claire remained in the kitchen watching closely. When I opened the door, Robert greeted me with a respectful nod. Good morning, Margaret, he said. His voice carried the calm professionalism I remembered well. I stepped aside to let him in. Thank you for coming on such short notice, I said. Robert removed his coat and glanced around the living room briefly, taking in the familiar surroundings. Claire walked in from the kitchen a moment later and offered him a polite but cautious smile. I did not realize we had a meeting scheduled, she said. Robert inclined his head slightly. This will only take a few minutes, he replied. The three of us moved into the living room where the morning light filled the space with a soft golden glow. Robert sat down in the chair across from the couch and placed a slim leather folder on the coffee table. Claire remained standing beside the window, her posture straight and guarded. Before we begin, she said, I should mention that I have already started arranging the sale of the property. Robert looked up at her calmly. I understand that may have been your assumption, he said. The word assumption seemed to hang in the air longer than the others. Claire narrowed her eyes slightly. What do you mean by that? She asked. Robert opened the leather folder and removed several neatly organized documents. He placed them carefully on the coffee table and turned the top page toward Claire so she could read the heading. For a moment the room fell completely silent. Claire leaned forward slightly, scanning the page. I watched her expression change as the meaning of the document slowly became clear. Her confident posture stiffened, and the color in her face faded just a little. This amendment to Daniel Lawson's estate plan was signed 2 months ago, Robert explained in a steady voice. It grants Margaret Lawson full lifetime ownership and control of this property. Claire looked up from the paper as if she had misheard something important. That cannot be correct, she said quickly. Robert did not raise his voice or change his tone. The document has been properly filed and notarized, he replied. Legally speaking, the house remains Margaret's residence for the duration of her lifetime. Claire stared at the papers again, turning the page as if searching for some hidden clause that would change the outcome. The room remained quiet except for the faint rustling of paper in her hands. I sat in Daniel's old armchair and watched the sunlight move slowly across the floor. For the first time since the night Claire told me to pack my bags, the house felt steady beneath my feet again. Claire believed she had been planning the future of this home for days. What she had not realized was that Daniel had already protected it long before she began making those plans. Claire continued staring at the document as if the words might rearrange themselves if she looked long enough. The confidence she had carried into the room only minutes earlier was beginning to fade, replaced by a tight uncertainty around her eyes. She flipped the page once more, and then set the papers down slowly on the coffee table. There must be some mistake, she said. Her voice was still controlled, but the calm certainty from before had begun to slip. Robert remained seated with the same composed posture he had maintained since arriving. There is no mistake, he replied evenly. Daniel reviewed these documents personally in my office. He was very clear about his intentions. Claire crossed her arms and looked toward me as if searching for some sign that I would contradict him. When I said nothing, she turned back to Robert again. Daniel and I were married, she said firmly. Everything he owned should transfer to me. Robert nodded politely as though he had expected that argument. In many cases that would be correct, he said. However, Daniel chose to revise certain elements of his estate plan before his passing. The amendment specifies that the property on Maple Street remains under Margaret Lawson's lifetime ownership. The quiet in the room felt heavier now. Outside the living room window the maple branches moved gently in the wind, scattering a few bright leaves across the lawn Daniel had always taken such pride in maintaining. Claire took a slow breath and looked back down at the papers again. But the house was in Daniel's name, she said. Robert folded his hands calmly on his knee. It was, he answered. Until he legally transferred lifetime control to Margaret 2 months ago. Claire's gaze shifted toward me again, sharper this time. Did you know about this? She asked. Her voice carried a mixture of disbelief and irritation. I met her eyes quietly. No, I said. Daniel left the documents in his desk. Claire looked away quickly as if that answer had only deepened her frustration. She picked up the top page again and read several lines silently. I could almost see the moment the legal language settled fully into her understanding. The muscles in her jaw tightened and her shoulders stiffened slightly. Robert continued speaking in the same measured tone. The document also specifies that the property cannot be listed for sale without Margaret's approval. Claire placed the paper back down on the table and straightened her posture. That is unreasonable, she said. Daniel would never expect me to live somewhere else. Robert did not react to the statement. The amendment does not require you to leave, he replied. However, the house itself cannot be sold or transferred without Margaret's consent. Claire looked around the living room slowly as if seeing it differently for the first time. The photographs on the mantel, the familiar furniture, the worn armchair where Daniel used to sit on Sunday afternoons. All of it remained exactly where it had always been, yet the power she believed she held over the house had quietly disappeared. She turned back toward Robert again. And if I choose not to accept this? She asked. Robert closed the leather folder and rested his hand on it. The document is legally binding, he said simply. The room fell silent again. I remained seated in the armchair, listening to the gentle ticking of the wall clock and the faint rustling of the maple leaves outside. Claire looked from Robert to me and then back to the papers one more time. For the first time since Daniel passed away, she seemed unsure of what to say next. The plan she had been outlining so carefully over the past 2 days had quietly unraveled in a matter of minutes. Robert stood up and gathered the documents neatly back into his folder. If either of you have additional questions about the estate arrangements, my office will be happy to assist, he said politely. Claire did not answer right away. She remained standing beside the window, staring at the driveway as if calculating what this new reality meant for her plans. I rose from the armchair and walked slowly toward the mantel where Daniel's photograph rested beside the clock. His smile in that picture looked exactly the way it had on the day it was taken, steady and thoughtful, as though he had already known that one day this moment would arrive. Behind me, Claire finally spoke again, but her voice no longer carried the certainty it had the day before. The house on Maple Street was no longer the easy opportunity she believed it to be. Daniel had made sure of that long before any of us realized why. Robert left the house a few minutes later, closing the front door quietly behind him. The sound of his car pulling away faded down Maple Street, leaving the living room wrapped in the same quiet that had filled it for so many years. Claire remained standing beside the window long after he was gone. She did not move for several seconds, as if she were still trying to rearrange the events of the past hour into something that made sense. Finally, she turned back toward the coffee table where the documents had rested only moments earlier. The yellow legal pad she had been using for her plans still sat there, its careful lists now strangely out of place. The words paint estimate and realtor meeting looked small and uncertain in the bright morning light. Claire picked up the pad and stared at it before slowly closing the cover. For the first time since Daniel passed away, she seemed unsure of what her next step would be. I walked back to the armchair near the window and sat down again, feeling the familiar comfort of the worn leather beneath my hands. Outside, the maple tree Daniel planted all those years ago moved gently in the wind, scattering a few more leaves across the yard. Autumn had always been Daniel's favorite season. He liked the quiet change in the air, the way the neighborhood slowed down just a little as summer faded away. Claire turned toward me after a moment. Her expression was no longer confident or impatient. It was thoughtful now, and perhaps a little unsettled. So the house cannot be sold, she said slowly. It was not exactly a question. I shook my head gently. Not without my permission, I replied. Claire glanced around the living room again, as though she were seeing the house differently than she had the day before. The photographs on the mantel, the old bookshelf Daniel built himself during his first year after college, the soft rug beneath the coffee table. Every corner of the room carried a quiet piece of the life Daniel had created. Here, Daniel never mentioned any of this, she said after a moment. Her voice had softened slightly, losing the sharp certainty it once carried. I folded my hands in my lap and looked toward the photograph of Daniel resting beside the clock. Daniel believed in planning ahead, I said. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window and looked out at the driveway where Robert's car had been parked only minutes earlier. The morning sun had grown brighter now, casting long shadows across the lawn. Finally she spoke again, though her voice sounded different this time. I suppose things will need to change, she said quietly. I watched her for a moment before replying. Perhaps, I said. The room grew quiet again, but this silence felt different from the uneasy tension that had filled the house the previous night. It felt steadier somehow, as if the foundation beneath the house had settled back into its proper place. Claire picked up her phone from the coffee table and looked at the screen. After a few seconds she placed it back down again without making a call. The plan she had spent 2 days arranging no longer fit the reality she had just discovered. I stood up and walked toward the mantel where Daniel's photograph rested. The image showed him standing in the backyard beside the maple tree during one of the first autumns after he planted it. He was smiling in the relaxed way he always did when he believed everything around him was exactly the way it should be. I touched the edge of the frame lightly before turning back toward the room. Claire remained near the window, still looking out across the yard. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Outside, the wind carried another small wave of leaves across the driveway Daniel used to sweep every Saturday morning. The house felt familiar again, the way it had before everything changed. Daniel had always said that a home was more than wood and walls. It was a promise between the people who built their lives inside it. As I stood there in the quiet living room, I realized that even after he was gone, Daniel had kept that promise. The house on Maple Street still belonged to the life we had built together, and for the first time since the day we buried my son, I understood that some things cannot be taken away simply because someone decides they should be.